a real banquet with the Lord, very special time. And Jonathan has, in his wisdom, chosen a very helpful title for today's talk. It's Trials. He could have entitled it Punishment, but it wasn't. It's about trials. And a word of warning, if you wish to give your pastor some helpful feedback on a sermon series, be prepared for the fact he may say there's a cracking 6 chapters in Samuel and I'd like you to look at them. But they are a cracking 6 chapters. And it comes in the middle of some right thoughtful time. Last week we were looking at the devastation of sin in our lives, and I think most of us came away from that very thoughtful. We might not be in the habit of beating old ladies over the head or robbing banks, but when you stand in the presence of the Almighty, of perfection itself, then suddenly your own imperfections get rather obvious. And we saw last week in chapters 10 through 14 of 2 Samuel how after a long period of war, they had finally brought the war against the Ammonites to the point where David could say to Joab, I've been fighting since I was barely a boy. You just go and finish this lot off. And then, of course, he saw Bathsheba from the roof of his palace. And we all know what happened after that. There was intrigue, there was deceit, there was adultery, and finally there was murder. And Joab, after Nathan had rebuked King David, Joab got him back out on the trail, and we finished with David actually having to take the credit for defeating the Ammonites, which was quite a political gesture by Joab. And this week we're coming on to the whole chapter of the rebellion against King David, when the roots of his throne were shaken to their very ends. But let's have a word of comfort before we start. You see, what we're thinking of today is the faithfulness of God to us despite our sin and through our sin and wherever we find ourselves. God is more faithful than we can possibly imagine. And we Christians often think that if life is hard, that must be something to do with us. It's our fault. Well, of course, we are sinful people. But actually, we live in a fallen world. And Jesus said that in this life, we would experience trouble, but we should be of good cheer, as one version puts it. Be encouraged, because he said he had overcome this world and he would be with us to the end of it. And that's what David found out in his time of his great trial. Now, Chronicles will give us a more polished version of this, if you like. It gives us the edited highlights from the Royal Chronicle. Samuel gives us the kind of raw newspaper coverage. If you've been reading this week about the phone hacking scandal and the things that have been going on in court, all human life is here in this passage. Once we get beyond the slightly deadpan delivery and the names and find out who they were, once we start to unravel the references, we find that there is nothing new under the sun here. This is a really blockbuster story. It's of intrigue, it's plotting, it's machinations at the highest level, it's things balancing on a knife edge, it's power struggles between one kingdom and another, and it's very, very human. And one thing that surprised me was that the main players in this section, the main names, whether they were conspiring for the northern tribes against the south, or whether they were loyal to King David and Judah on the south, they all descended from one immensely influential family, headed up by David's father Jesse. This is a story about inter-family fighting, cousins doing dreadful things to each other. We tend to think of David as an obscure shepherd boy. Well, he was sent out to look after the sheep because that was a way of toughening somebody up where there were lions and wolves around. If you're preparing somebody for major trials in life, you get them fighting the tough stuff at once. And that's what David did. He was part of an extremely powerful family, generals, mighty soldiers. And the Talmud described Jesse as, and his wife actually, as remarkable people sitting in the eye of political storm. And we have to remember that conflict and conspiracy and death ran all through David's life in these books. We sometimes think that he led this charmed life where he slung a sling and slew giants and he conquered people without a problem. without a care in the world, but it's much, much grittier than that. Get into the Psalms and find out how lonely he was. Remember the times when he was harassed beyond belief, when he had only outlaws to help him. Outlaws and renegades, it says. He was a man who lived in the eye of a storm himself for most of his life. And when we're tempted to judge him, we need to remember the strains that he was under. And we need to remember that the strains that we live under today, the trials that come to us in our life, are ones in which God accompanies us every foot of the way, whether we get things right or not. And I think we need a quick overview of chapters 15 to 16. Forgive me if I refer to notes, but it's so detailed that I need to keep a straight path through here. But in chapter 15, Absalom had returned from exile. You remember Absalom had plotted the death, instructed the death of a brother. There had been rape within a family. Absalom came back, and he was not really well received. Although Joab had brought him back to the king via a ruse, there was not really good communication between father and son. Chapter 15 unravels for us just how Absalom went about plotting and putting himself well in the eyes of men. And it takes us on to chapter 16 and David's flight, the way that he tried to place advisors in different places to put people back in the courts of the new king. This is a story that would have been written by John le Carré, but this is even more gripping than that. This is about brave men putting their lives at risk by going to the heart of trouble. Then into chapter 17, and we find one of David's key advisors, a man with enormous wisdom, who turned against David, Ahithophel. And Ahithophel was giving some very good advice about how to catch a fugitive, aging king. And one of the brave men who went back into the court, and the Bible says that God frustrated the wisdom of Ahithophel through this other man. He said, "Oh no, your father is a doughty fighter. He won't be with the troops. He'll be doing this, that, and the other. They'll fight like cornered lions. Get all Israel together, make sure you're really strong, and then go after him." And of course gave David time to escape and to be warned by other brave men who had to be hidden in a well, and so on. Read it through. My heart beats still as I think of all that they went through. What did Ahithophel do after his advice was rejected? He was that wise, he went home and he hanged himself because he knew worse would happen to him if the king came back. So, we are only 2 or 3 chapters into this. We have bloodshed on a considerable scale. We have intrigue. And by the time we get to chapter 18, you find Absalom's death and David's grief. Despite all the things that this boy had done to him, this young man, he was so grieving that he didn't want him to be killed. And he was grieved that he had been killed, I should say. He had given instructions not to kill him. Who killed him? Somebody will come on to later. Joab. And it is very pithy and earthy. When one of the men came to Joab and said, "I've found the rebellious Absalom. He's hanging by his hair in the forest. He's been caught in the branches of a tree." And Joab said, "Why didn't you finish him off then?" And the man said, "Look, you heard what the king told all of us. If I had killed him, would you have stood by me? I'm not going to stand around wasting time like this," said Joab, and he took 3 spears and just stabbed Absalom through the heart as he hung there. You get a flavor of the kind of men that were around David and the kind of circumstances he lived in. By the time David came back, he came back to a mixed return. Of course, people who had not gone out with him were saying, "Well, we were prevented, we have been betrayed." Coming back, he had to sort out all the mixed motives and otherwise of the people who had not gone with him. And before we get on to the rebellion of Sheba and the revenge of the Gibeonites, let's stick with some of the amazing characters who did help David when he left. Christians will find help in unexpected places. And one of the most moving passages in the Bible for me is Ittai the Gittite, who was a foreigner with his 600 guys, and they had thrown in their lot with King David years ago. And when David marched out of the city, out of his stronghold, who should he find dressed militarily in front of him but Ittai the Gittite and his 600 men? And the king said, "My brother, you don't have to do this. Go to the new king. Why should you throw in your lot with me when the Lord has punished me the way he has?" And Ittai simply said, "My lord, where you go, we will go," echoing very other famous words in the Bible. "Whether to live or to die, we will follow you." And King David was so overcome, all he could say was, "March on." And they marched out into the desert, a select handful. They had 3 very good generals. They had Joab, they had his brother Abishai, and they had Ittai the Gittite, who was a man for a tight place. And so they went out to fight, and as they went out to fight with relatively little stores, all the countryside wept along the way. That's an encouragement, that people knew that a tragedy had fallen upon the nation, and they wept as the king went out. And various people came out to help them, some with mixed motives, like Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who was probably angling for the entire family goods, but we'll come to that later. But also other older friends, and a man who was very ancient and who put the resources of their household towards the king and his troops in their hour of need. We will find help in our hour of need. This is what this says to us. And I thought about this as living in a turbulent world. We do live in a turbulent world. Perhaps we should see the rebellion of Absalom as a powerful example of what would have happened more often if the Lord hadn't protected David from the worst intentions of his enemies. The Psalms reflect, how often David felt immensely lonely and oppressed, and wicked men coming after him. But after the matter of Uriah and his wife Bathsheba, God did stand back a little, and he allowed some of the consequences of that sin to occur. But God did not cast David from his presence. God did restore him to power and honor. We must note how God was with David all through these trials, through all the complex intrigues and through all the battles. And he will be with us too. We must never doubt that. And part of living in a turbulent world is working with tough people. We will be working alongside some fairly interesting characters in the course of our lives. Let's take Joab, just one of many, but Joab was a most successful general, and he was a courageous fighter. We know that. He was a first cousin to King David. The Talmud described him as a very powerfully built man. You didn't mess with him physically, and you certainly didn't mess with him otherwise. And his brother Abishai, they were both both sons of David's sister Zeruiah. His brother Abishai was one of the great fighting men of Israel. He was one of the 30. So within this family, we have David, Joab, Abishai, and there are 2 more we haven't mentioned yet. A massively powerful family, all related to each other. And they made a very formidable power-broking team. You have these 2 people behind you, you have a lot of support, but they are very flawed indeed. And interesting, a footnote on their mother Zeruiah. She must have been a most remarkable woman, because normally in the Old Testament, you were known by your patronymic, who your father was. Here, these 2 immensely powerful men are known by who their mother was. And Joab supported Judah against all the tribes of Israel, and he maintained the kingdom of David, but he was fiercely protective of his own position. And if you've read these chapters through, you'll note that he killed treacherously to maintain it. If someone could help Anna in through the door there, she's just coming in with her wheelchair. So, at the start of David's reign over Israel and Judah, Joab slew his own cousin Abner. As a political move, David had offered Abner the combined generalship of all the armies. That was not good enough for Joab. He slew him. And towards the end of David's reign, after the rebellion had been put down, he did the same thing again. And he did it to another cousin from the north. Amasa was the son of David's other sister, Abigail. And the way he did it was so devious They met together, the armies, the opposing generals, and he went up to him, took his beard with the right hand, which is your fighting hand, and he stabbed him with the left. And he did such a good job of it, the Bible describes how all the men coming up, seeing this man wallowing in his blood, wouldn't pass by him. David was surrounded by loyal but very fierce people. We could say that Joab recognized that he couldn't possibly compete with David. He arranged the return of Absalom when he saw the king was mourning over him. He arranged it via a trick. And there's a nice moment at one point when the lady who's been chosen to do this is pouring out this tale, and suddenly David says to her, I want to ask you something and don't hold it back from me. My Lord is like an angel who can see anything. Is Joab behind this? Yes, my Lord, he is. So Absalom was returned, but there was no communication between father and son. Joab wanted one strong king at a time, and he did think that a traitor should die, whether he was a prince or not. So, in looking at Joab, we've really looked at a microcosm of the people that were around him. David might have been a man after God's own heart, but he was kept in power by some pretty ruthless people, and he had to work with them sometimes whether he liked it or not. And I also was reminded, looking at this, about godly relationships in a challenging world. Each of us needs to look at our relationships, our friendships, how we keep with our family. It's very hard to describe this great man, David, as a good family man. I stand to be corrected, but he did seem to avoid emotional intimacy by surrounding himself not with one wife, but with many wives and many concubines. Okay, it was the done thing for the time. We chaps had a think about this week. But actually, he had two remarkable women that we know of for his wife. Surely that would have been enough. And we know he was out fighting a lot, and he was immensely stressed in his life of a king. But despite really obvious affection for his boys, he seemed to have made little time to bring them up himself or to exert any regular discipline. I think when we see that two of his older sons committed grave crimes, one, rape, the other, instructed murder, he was careful not to do it himself, neither of them received any of the sanctions of Jewish law. As the king's sons, they were above all this. He never addressed the problem. And there are many problems that we don't address in our own lives that God wishes us to be brave enough to face up to. And one could say that these boys were spoiled, but boy, were the consequences lethal. When Absalom was exiled, David made no real attempt to approach him. When Absalom arranged for him to be brought back, no real attempt was made. And he never addressed Absalom's politicking. Read through the chapter which describes how Absalom made himself into a kingly presence with 50 men. He would approach everybody coming to law. Of course, ultimately you were approaching the king and saying, oh, I wish I were a judge in Israel. Then you would have somebody to speak for you, my brother. I am the one you need. He also moved to Hebron. He said, I need to go and make sacrifices at Hebron. And David would have known that Hebron was where he himself was king before he became king over all Israel. Hebron is a stepping point for kingship. So there was all that going on around, and David never addressed any of it. I can't possibly criticize him for that, but I do observe that what we said earlier, God sometimes preserves us from the consequences of our sins, and sometimes he does not. But what I was really impressed by this week in looking at this, over the past 2 to 3 weeks in looking at this, is how God is our rock in the storms of life. You know, this combined kingdom was a very fragile affair. There were constant shufflings and movings. And we might know now that King David was God's anointed, but I bet you at the time a lot of people would have begged to differ. We have the result. They didn't have the result then. Let's look at Absalom a moment. It is a great tragedy, this raising up of one son against his father. But theologically, he broke a whole raft of the Ten Commandments. Perhaps the turning point in his life was the rape of his sister, to whom he was very devoted and to whom he showed great kindness afterwards. And when his father did nothing to Amnon, under the law at the time, a fine and marriage would have been the appropriate thing to do. You had to look after this woman whom you had taken advantage of. Nothing like that happened at all. This festering resentment started to creep in. But he let those resentments get the better of him. Then he ordered the death of his own brother under the pretense of a family feast, when his brother was cheerful with much wine and everybody was laughing. And he killed just the one brother, but at first the news was that he had killed all the royal sons. People were very much aware of the inter-family strife that was going on. He dishonored his own father by raising a sword against him in battle, and by dishonoring him with adultery with his father's concubines, who were a second-class wife. He dishonored his own father in a way that David never dishonored Saul. David was very particular not to raise a hand against the Lord's anointed. And because Absalom was seeking power for himself, unwittingly, and this can happen to any of us, unwittingly, he had become a tool of evil. And what was he being a tool for? He was being a tool of evil against God's purpose for the whole of Israel, to be a nation set apart, to be a nation under Abraham, through whom everyone could be blessed. So he was setting himself not only against his father and the kingship, but against God himself and eternal purposes. That was overcome. David was brought back to power. He grieved so much over Absalom that Joab had to go and speak to him very crisply again and said, look, every one of your men has lost heart because you're mourning over this person. Get out there and sit in the city gate and basically say thank you to these men who put their lives on the line for you. Get out there and do it. Sometimes we need to be spoken to even by folks who are not of the faith in order to get back to grips. God can speak to us through anybody, and we'd better listen. David listened, and he went back and sat in the gate. But there is a really sad footnote to all of this. Yes, it's wonderful that David came back. Yes, you can read, I think it is in chapter 20, how he sorted out the difficult issues of those who had opposed him, those who might have opposed him, those who were possibly going to be against him. In chapter 20, there is still one kickback, a guy called Sheba, who was a troublemaker and went again through the tribes of Israel, blowing a trumpet, it said, and trying to rouse people back to civil war again. The nation had decided, the northern tribes as well, look, this guy David, he was the person who drove out the Philistines. He has helped us against the Philistines. You know, he's our relative. We will stick with him. But Sheba tried again, and they pursued him to a town, which was a town of refuge. Interesting. We'll come in a future session to another place of refuge, which didn't work. He went to a town of refuge in his treachery, and Joab and the entire army assembled against it. Who did they get to speak to them? Women play a very interesting part in this story. They chose a wise woman of that town who called out, "Is Joab here?" And Joab said, "I'm here." "Why have you come to set your swords against a town that is a mother in Israel?" He said, "We haven't come for you. We've come for that troublemaker who's inside." And she said, "Leave it with me, and his head will be thrown over the wall." That's a very stern lady. And his head was thrown over the wall, and they went away again. Why are all these things written for us? I think they are written to show us that God is right in the midst of our human sorrows, our trials. To one final passage, which which brought tears to me as I read it, which is the story of Rizpah and the men who were offered up to the Gibeonites. Sometimes people will tell you that God is a vengeful person. He is not vengeful at all. He is just, and that's different, but he is not vengeful. The story of this is that King Saul, in his zeal for the Lord, and he did have zeal for the Lord, misplaced on occasion, but he sought to wipe out by genocide the Gibeonites. And you might remember that they fooled the Israelites 300 or 400 years beforehand when they were conquering Canaan by saying, oh, no, we're not part of the tribes here at all. We're sort of related to you. And they found out later that this was not true. So their lives were spared, and there was a promise that they'd be spared, but they had to do menial tasks like chopping wood and drawing water. But Saul pursued them and tried to wipe them out. And there was a famine in the land, and David again sought the Lord. And the Lord said, not a famine, there was a drought. And the Lord said, it's because of what Saul did to the Gibeonites. Now we notice that God did not tell him what to do about it, just said, I'm drawing your attention to past wrongdoing. Then David asked the Gibeonites, what do you want us to do for you? And the Gibeonites did not want wholesale slaughter, but they wanted 7 sons of Saul's clan. Difficulty. There's a promise here. David has already made a promise to Mephibosheth that he shan't die. So the 2 sons of Rizpah, one of Saul's concubines, and 5 other sons of another lady were given over to the Gibeonites, and they were put to death out on the hillside. And here comes this great woman of Israel, who in a very brutal man's world could have been forgiven. Read up. Youngsters love this particularly, about the 6-toed giant, and the guy with 6 fingers on his hands, how tall they were. And now the Goliath crops up. One of David's own nephews actually killed a particular giant. The Bible is trying to make the point that from start to finish, David did not have an easy life. So why is all this account here? Is it to draw a moral lesson? Well, yes. In one sense it is. The Bible likes us to learn from things. It likes us to take things to heart. But this really vivid account of drama and passion, of wrongdoing, of incredible trials, it's here because the Bible wants to capture our imagination. It wants to capture our hearts so that we don't just do things with our heads, but our hearts are engaged and our feelings. And it wants to capture our devotion. It wants to show us, firstly, how deeply God is involved in human affairs. Even in our messy and sinful ones, he is deeply involved with each of us. Never assume that he's not there. He will be somewhere. And secondly, the Bible wants to show us that even in punishment or sorrow or trials, his people will find support and encouragement. It will come in unexpected places and at unexpected times. And it will come when we do not deserve it. That is the most wonderful thing of all. It will be there. And finally, thirdly, it shows how God restores his people. We know every week, because we're reminded, Jesus died for us, and we can probably say the whole thing. But God wants it to be in here. He wants us to know how he suffers with us, how he restores his people after trial and great tribulation. And he told us this story to show that David was returned to royal power. Not only that, he was given a true heir, an heir to the throne, of whom people still speak today. We still talk of the wisdom of Solomon, many centuries after he passed away. So all this passage is about our fallenness, our waywardness, our wickedness sometimes, and it's about God's constant love and his justice and his mercy. And a word that we come to several times in the Bible, his loving kindness. That's for you and for me in this account of King David's life. let's have a moment of quiet before we sing. Peter, I wonder if you've got Psalm 51 anywhere to hand, could you put up verse 7? This I would like to leave us with as one of God's promises to his fallen